Have your attention, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start because we are overrunning as it is, so thank you very much for rejoining the conference after lunch. I'm sorry I wasn't here during the morning session. Session 3, as you know, will be on political and economic aspects, and the session will concentrate on political issues relating to Cyprus as well as economic aspects relating to the problem and the wider region, including the international aspects of the issue, but also on the political dimension involving the British Cypriot community in this country. And we have 4 excellent and diverse presenters. In Dr. James Ker-Lindsay, who is very well known, Senior Research Fellow at the LSE, well known for his academic work and his numerous publications on the subject of Cyprus. Andreas Rialas on my right, a good friend of mine and also a friend of Epistimi. He's a very successful hedge fund manager, specializing in emerging markets, including Turkey. He runs Argo Capital Management, which he founded about 10 years ago, wasn't it, Andreas? Yes. Nick Venedi, who is sitting on my right as well, bearded. He's a senior trades union figure in the UK, one of very few Cypriots, really, of people of Cypriot origin in the UK involved in the trades union movement for a number of years now. I'm delighted he's here with us, and he's working within the ranks of Unison, one of the largest trades union organizations in the country. I find Nick's political insights invaluable, and his efforts to highlight the need for greater engagement by UK Cypriots in the British political system certainly resonates with me. Finally, on my right as well, next to Andreas, we have Farid Mirbagheri. Have I pronounced that correctly? Because everyone gets my surname wrong. So. He's a PhD in international relations, currently dialogue chair in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Nicosia. He has written extensively in relation to Cyprus, and he will focus on the role of the UN in the context of the Cyprus issue and the way that this has been perceived by the various stakeholders on and off the island. I will start with James, and we'll take the presenters in the order in which they appear in the program in front of you, and then we will invite questions and contributions. James.
Thank you very much, Peter, and also obviously like to extend my warmest thanks to the organisers of today's event. When the call was put out for papers, and I started to think, well, what can I talk about? There's so much if we're considering 50 years of independence. And really what I actually settled on was asking more of a question today, rather than giving a specific paper detailing one particular aspect. And that question is, what should Cyprus's relationship with NATO be? Now, this actually has a number of different elements to it, and is actually rather important on a number of levels. And what I'd like to do is briefly sketch out the relationship that Cyprus has had over 50 years with the organisation and with other organisations, and perhaps explain a little bit as to why it's so important today, and really hopefully generate a bit of debate and discussion as to where this relationship should perhaps go in the future. Now, when Cyprus became independent in 1960, in fact, the question of NATO membership was the one issue that actually united the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish government. There was perhaps differences on every other issue, but this was one thing that united them, but for very different reasons. For Archbishop Makarios and the Greek Cypriot leadership, there was deep concern at the prospect of NATO membership on the grounds that there was the feeling that Turkey was the preeminent partner over Greece and Turkey within the organisation, and that if anything should happen, the organisation would naturally take Turkey's side on things. Interestingly enough, in Ankara there was deep opposition to Cyprus membership of NATO because there was the feeling that if anything happened, NATO would step in and prevent Turkey from being able to act. And so, as I say, this created this sort of broad agreement between the two sides that this was actually something that should be pushed off the agenda. Now, of course, for Archbishop Makarios, there was another aspect to this, which, of course, was his very good relations with the non-aligned movement as it was developing. And that, in the end, happened to be the direction that the Republic took. And it served Cyprus extremely well, I think, all things considered, especially in the post-1974 era. The strong relations that Cyprus had built with many of the Middle East states which were members of the non-aligned movement, plus also other countries such as Yugoslavia, but looking over into Asia, meant that Cyprus, the Cypriot government, was able to take build up on those relations and ensure that attempts by the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey to get recognition for northern Cyprus, especially after 1983, was effectively blocked, and so it worked remarkably well. However, as part of Cyprus's process of EU membership, it actually had to lead the non-aligned movement. I'm still not entirely sure as to why that was the case. The official reason was because it was to do with alignment with the European Union's common foreign security policy. But why sort of linking up with the non-aligned movement would be considered to be contrary to the CFSP, but somehow membership of NATO, when not all the other members of the European Union were NATO members, was considered to be okay. It's still not entirely clear in my mind, but be that as it may, this was a decision that was forced on the Cypriot government. But when it left the non-aligned movement, it joined the European Union, it was very, very keen to point out that it intended to be a bridge between the non-aligned movement, the third world states, the developing states, however you would call them, and the European Union, and made this a central plank of its foreign policy. However, since then, in fact, what we've actually seen is a growing debate in Cyprus about where Cyprus should now stand as regards NATO. As I mentioned already, being a member of the European Union does not necessarily mean having to join NATO. There are a number of other states which aren't, of course, members of NATO. Immediate countries that spring to mind, for example, are Ireland, Finland, Austria. You can pursue a policy of neutrality and still be a member of the European Union. You don't need to be tied with NATO. But there are some very good reasons why NATO membership, or certainly participation in Partnership for Peace, could be seen as particularly beneficial. And it's interesting to see that 3 of the main political parties on the island have now come out and favour some sort of formal link between the Republic and Partnership for Peace. But it's very, very strongly opposed by AKEL. Partly, I think, well, certainly because of the historical legacy and antipathy towards NATO. But also, I think that we should consider various other factors, which is looking ahead and the possibility of a solution in Cyprus. The question of NATO is going to remain extremely important. For example, peacekeeping on the island. As we know, for almost 50 years, this has been a role that's been undertaken by the United Nations, and I think admirably done. But there are those who suggest that if there is a solution, then maybe it would be time for a rethink on how peacekeeping is conducted. Should the United Nations continue in this role? Is it best suited for it? Maybe this should be something that would be handed over to a more European-oriented forum, and NATO might be that option. But there are other aspects that I think we need to consider, which is, for example, the defence of Cyprus. As many of you are aware, one of the ideas that has been put on the table is, in amongst others, for a solution is that Cyprus would be demilitarised. But as we also know, Cyprus stands in a very, very dangerous part of the world, and there are very serious questions that must be asked about how Cyprus will be able to defend itself if it is demilitarised. For example, air defence, Coast Guard. Is this something that perhaps Cyprus should be able to do by itself, so in effect have a small armed forces, maybe not a land force, but certainly air or naval forces, or is this something that could be perhaps handed over to an outside organisation, and would NATO be the sort of organisation that could do that? Of course, there are counter-arguments to this. One very prominent reason you could suggest is that in actual fact, would this make Cyprus more of a target rather than less of a target? By joining NATO, would it mean then that Cyprus is already the Far East outpost of the European Union? It would also become another of the Far East outposts of NATO. Turkey would, of course, be geographically furthest east. But nevertheless, there is a feeling that maybe this could be a source of instability. What sort of effect would this have, for example, on Cyprus's relationship with the Middle East countries? And what sort of effect would it have on Cyprus's relationship with Russia, which has obviously been another important ally for the Cypriot government over the years? But I think it's also important to mention here that demilitarization in of itself need not count Cyprus out of NATO. There is already a precedent of a country that is demilitarized that's a member of NATO, and that, of course, is Iceland. But I think there are a couple of other very good reasons why this should be considered. So, for example, certainly Partnership for Peace, the argument that this is somehow contrary to Cyprus's best interests, would destabilise relations with Russia. That need not be the case. For a start, Russia is a member of Partnership for Peace, as are many of the countries that are closely aligned with Russia in Central Asia. And even Serbia, which, as we all know, just over a decade ago was bombed by NATO, has actually been a member of Partnership for Peace now for 2 or 3 years. And in a European security context, I think that this is also a debate to be had in the sense that it's extremely important. The debate over whether Europe is now going to form its own security structures has effectively been answered, and answered in a way that people who harbour dreams of Euro-federalism are likely to be deeply disappointed. European Union's not going to move in that direction. Security factors are going to remain very, very clearly in the hands of NATO. And is it the case that Cyprus needs to have a seat round that table, whether it's as a formal member or whether it's a member of Partnership for Peace, and be able to influence the debate, to take part? Now, of course, at the moment, this is all rather moot. Cyprus could not join NATO or Partnership for Peace due to the Turkish veto over it. But really, what I just wanted to do today was sort of explain that this has been a recurring theme, a big question in Cypriot foreign policy, its relationship with the West, with the Western military alliance, and that it's now coming back onto the agenda, and is certainly something worth thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. And what I'll do is we will hear from all of the presenters, and then there will be debate at the end. So I will immediately move on to Andreas, who will concentrate on Turkey and Turkey's increasingly assertive foreign policy, which we've witnessed in the last few weeks and the last few months in relation to Israel, Iran, and other issues in the region. So over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is not an academic perspective. What I do is I manage a fund that invests or goes short in emerging market bonds. And I have been involved in Turkey for quite a while. And in my company, we run what we call the sovereign risk model that tracks a lot of countries, which looks at their economic, their fiscal balance, their balance of payments, looks at debt to GDP ratios and so on, in order to ascertain really any risk of default in a particular sovereign. So we have to see Turkey in that perspective, and I think this is quite often ignored, particularly in the Cyprus context. We have the notion of the deep state in Turkey, which is a fairly valid notion, but I think that the devil really is in the detail quite often, and that Turkey has had the ebbs and lows depending also on its financial power and predicament at any one point in time. I mean, I can pass on this afterwards to people. It's quite an interesting thing. Not necessarily will make much sense to a lot of people, but you can see the statistics, for example, of Turkey going back to the early 90s on a number of 6-7 ratios, which the practitioners in my field consider to be the, let's say, the determining factors for sovereign solvency. And as you all follow the news, you realize that today is a particularly relevant concept, whereas we never thought that Europe had a solvency issue. We're finding out that it does. Well, Turkey has been in the midst of this. In the early 90s, it went through a big financial crisis. It had to be bailed out. In 2000, 2001, it went through a big financial crisis. It had to be bailed out by the IMF. In Cyprus, we have not, let's say, appreciated, in my opinion, how deeply this type of shock has affected Turkish policy through the cycle. I mean, just to give you two simple, let's say, measures that one would see how Turkey has changed. And Turkey in the past 10 years has become the paradigm of fiscal prudence from a pariah. And just if you go back to 2001 when they were bailed out, the reserves to debt service ratio, which basically indicates the short-term ability of a country to pay its debts, in Turkey was about 48%. Inflation was close to 60%. The IMF came through, they started balancing their budget. At that time we saw it was really renewed effort by the Turkish authorities and the Erdogan government winning elections on the back of the completely discredited sort of secular establishment after an IMF bailout. They came in and they started really implementing what we see that is been happening in Greece today. Fairly tough financial program with cuts, balancing the books and so on. This has had an amazing effect on the country, and the problem of the country at the time was, let's say, a credibility gap. The same thing that Greece went today, this year and said we couldn't do the statistics right and nobody believes us. The same position was Turkey, because nobody believed the politicians in Turkey. So Erdogan came in and used this idea of the EU accession. I mean, why would a country want to be part of the EU? The reason the Turks wanted to be a part of the EU is because it gave them an anchor outside their own political establishment to implement a certain program of government reform that was otherwise very difficult to bring about or to be brought about by the political establishment in Turkey. Moving on now, 10 years on, the reserves to debt service ratio of Turkey is 130%. Still, still is not brilliant, but it's more comfortable than many other places. That what that means is that they can live without borrowing for 12, 13, 14 months. Not many countries in Europe right now can do that. So it's a decent ratio. Inflation is down to 8.6% and it's going through a period of, it was even lower, which was a great achievement for Turkey, in that through this program, it actually put its house in order. It managed to pay off its IMF loans. And despite the fact that Turkey still is facing, it has a short-term debt demand that is disproportionate to the overall debt, and it is facing some rollover pressure every year in the current environment, is facing rollover pressure. They have been refusing for close to 2 years to sign up to a new IMF agreement, because they think, look, we can do it on our own, we want our national independence, we're not going to get prescribed solutions from the IMF. And it was almost a joke, I do attend the IMF meeting every year, which last September, it was in Istanbul, in Constantinople. And the running joke is Turkey negotiating to get an IMF deal. It's been happening for 2 years, and still Erdogan refuses to do that. So and they have right now, they're reasserting a mindset right now which is quite in line with the way we see them behaving politically on the financial field. Basically, they're saying we can do it on our own. They're implementing what they call a fiscal responsibility law, which basically sets benchmarks on what the country and the government should do in terms of budget. And I can tell you, I went to a small meeting of 5 or 6 people with a presentation given by Mr. Babagan, and you know what his line is? Europe, you know, kind of, they have no credibility, these guys. You know, while us, the truth, Erdogan's party, if we promise something, we deliver it. So it is that kind of strong feeling that they are propagating, and I think that's the kind of behavior we've seen to, you know, in the recent events with Gaza, in the Iran affair. So I do think there is a great link that we kind of miss in Cyprus with their ability as an economy to grow and so on, that affects their policy and their attitude and their approach. Even though they have a consistent message that they keep repeating on the political level, the strength of that message is also determined by how confident they feel economically. My sort of perception of this want to go it alone approach has some ramifications and also some risks for them, because however good their economy has been, and just to give you an indication right now why Turkey is kind of going on a high, to borrow for 5 years, Turkey pays 2% above German bonds interest, whilst Turkey is 10%, Greece is 10%, Spain is 3%. So they actually now are borrowing cheaper than what we consider anchors of the European Union. So for them, increasingly, European Union seems to be an irrelevant thing, and if they feel and they convince themselves that because we are able to do this to be fiscally prudent on our own back, we do not really need to take sort of orders or leadership from this thing called EU. Therefore, the EU anchor has become a lot less important for them. And the truth, like all European citizens are feeling disillusioned by the European project, in the sense that you determine a set of rules and then everybody goes around not keeping those rules. That does produce some disillusionment in the European citizens. The same thing has happened in Turkey. The problem that Erdogan is facing, though, is that the economic crisis, despite the perception that they have done very well out of it, it is hitting Turkey. The voting base of Erdogan was not the big establishment in the cities, the sort of high upper class, is the small businesses, is SMEs, is the regional, let's say, entrepreneurs, very socially conservative, but at the same time very keen to export, to grow, entrepreneurial and so on. This has been his base. And the fact that he hasn't taken an IMF deal, what this has resulted in is that the short-term rollover need of the state has crowded out the banking system. So even though their economy is doing better than the rest, it is equally difficult for the small businesses to get credit in Turkey. And that's the only place they're going to get credit, because the banks prefer to earn 8–10% lending this money to the government. This makes the government safe, in the sense that they can roll over their short-term debt, It creates a positive environment on the government finances, but it is crowding out what is, in essence, Erdogan's main power base, which is these small SMEs. And I think we have witnessed this pressure, this loss of popularity, this erosion of the power base, because they themselves are feeling the pressure and they're beginning to think for the first time that Erdogan is not so great after all. That's why I believe we've seen an even more accentuated nationalistic phase from Turkey. So I think one of the reasons we're seeing this more extreme, being the leader in Iran, being the leader of against Israel, it's very much linked to his ability to, let's forget the EU anchor, let's be more traditional in Turkey. If I cannot satisfy my power base through economic and financial growth, I can do nationalistic as well as the other guys can do. So that's my feeling of what he's doing. And just to conclude, Cyprus has to think, again, one of our prejudices in Cyprus is that we've got a card to play because Turkey definitely wants to be part of the EU. What if they do not care about the EU? What if the EU renders itself irrelevant? What do? We have to have a strategy for that. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's something that we have to think about. Anyway, that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We've had some very interesting perspectives from both James and Andreas. Who wants to go next? Would you like to go next? Would you like to go next? Bearing in mind your subject is probably more directly related to what we just heard. So, Farid, on the UN and the UN's
in the next 6 to 8 minutes, I'll be giving a very extremely brief account of the UN role in Cyprus since 1950s. It started in the General Assembly by Greece taking the case of Cyprus as a case of self-determination. At the time, the Cold War dominated world politics. Americans were not happy about this and tried very much to keep it out of the UN and outside the reach of the Soviet Union. And that's how it actually happened. A deal, London-Zurich agreements, was reached. NOCs and taxing were both excluded. Incidentally, Cyprus, I think, must have been the only country, the only colony that fought not for independence, but for actually joining another country. But this new republic, which was dubbed reluctant republic by some, didn't last, ran into trouble after 3 years with 13 amendments proposed by the President of the Republic, rejected by Turkey and Turkish Cypriot leadership. In order to contain the fighting, Resolution 186 of 4th of March 1964 was adopted. A UN force was dispatched to the island, and a mediator, Gallo Plaza, was appointed. After a year, the mediator published his report. It was rejected by Turkey and Turkish Cypriots. After that, mediation, or active mediation, was put aside, and the United Nations started the process of passive mediation called the Good Offices of the Secretary General. Only after 1974 and during the Annan Plan, active mediation again was played out as regards the Cyprus problem. Otherwise, it was intercommunal negotiations and passive mediation. Part of the failure of intercommunal negotiations reflected lack of consistency between description and prescription by the UN. In Resolution 186, the UN notes that any solution must have the agreement of outside countries, Greece, Turkey, United Kingdom, as well as the government of Cyprus and the Turkish Cypriot community, which means the Cyprus problem has two elements, external and internal, and the solution must address both. Intercommunal negotiations, however, only addresses the internal aspect of the Cyprus problem and not the external. And overlooking this aspect lessened the chance of a solution. Both internal aspect and external aspect must be accommodated. In themselves, they are necessary conditions, but not sufficient. They both have to be addressed. On the peacekeeping that the UN has been involved, UNPICEF has been dubbed one of the most successful traditional United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus, with the exception that it has failed to restore normal conditions. It was initially 7 countries, Austria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Sweden and the UK, over 6,000 troops. Today the numbers have shrunk to under 1,000, even though there are 11 contributing countries, troop contributing countries. This rather quote-unquote successful aspect of peacekeeping in Cyprus has had possibly 3 unwanted side effects on diplomatic efforts. They are removal of urgency, arrival of complacency, and untying the hands of belligerent parties. When nobody is getting killed, then the problem is no longer urgent. When the problem is no longer urgent, you may feel the status quo is the solution. These 2 elements may have been the unwanted consequences or side effects of good traditional peacekeeping. Also, untying the hands of belligerent parties, when you feel you are immune from the consequences of your intransigence. You may wait until such time that you think your ideal solution will come. And therefore you have this superstition that time is on your side, because you feel you will not pay for intransigence. This was particularly so when Mr. Denktash was the leader of the Turkish Cypriot community. But of course, if you expose the communities to the consequences of their own intransigence, that doesn't mean there will be a solution, because there is no indication that they'll be happy with anything in the nature of half a loaf. It will only expose the weaker party militarily to the demands of the stronger one. On the diplomatic front, the UN as a diplomatic body must always be optimistic. That's how it has been. Even though it has had a number of setbacks and all failures, it's still optimistic on diplomatic fronts. The UN as an international organization consists of states, and it cannot in an independent manner act in an independent manner that would defy the wishes of its members. In one instance, it can apply the doctrine of collective security in the case of Kuwait. In other instances, it may not wish to do so. That's not because the UN per se wants so, because its stronger members want it that way. Any expectation, therefore, that the UN can manipulate international actors on the Cyprus issue without the support of its key members may be unrealistic. Turkey, with around 40,000 troops, is a key player, of course, and its influence greatly already through the Treaty of Guarantee was enhanced after the 1974 invasion.
You find it so that it's
It's all right. It has been suggested that Cyprus has been an asset to Turkey and Greece in their squabbles, even though I would say it has definitely been more of an asset to Turkey. It has also been an asset to some of the European powers who want to keep Turkey out of the European Union. the Cyprus problem plays a role bigger than Cyprus itself. The legitimacy of the UN and the unique multilateral context it affords for acknowledgement of rights and obligation of the states has been an effective tool for the Cyprus government to keep the problem alive in the context of the breach of its territorial integrity by the occupying Turkish forces. Therefore, we see that's why the UN is so important to the Cyprus government. Even in 1974, when there was a resolution after the invasion in the General Assembly asking for foreign troops to leave the island, even the Turkish ambassador voted for it. It did not wish to be embarrassed in the embarrassing minority of one. Therefore, the impact of the UN on states involved with the Cyprus problem, directly or indirectly, is very limited. Obviously, there are behind closed door meetings, but these are more informational and procedural. Beyond that, the key players in the UN must be willing to turn the screws in a sufficiently powerful manner and in the right direction on the relevant countries to produce the kind of results that are sought by those interested in the Cyprus question. And that may have to be adopted, if at all, at certain diplomatic and political cost, which may in themselves prove a deterrent. The impact of the UN on the local factors, internal factors, is important. You know, there is the 6-monthly report of the United Nations. I can give you a few examples. 1960s, Youth and then Secretary General stated in a report that Turkish Cypriots have imposed a policy of self-isolation. At the same time, he said that there is a question of austerity, and some of this Turkish Cypriots in states of starvation. Boutros Ghali, much later, in his report, referred to the negative impact of Turkish Cypriot leadership on his efforts on confidence-building measures. Kurt Waldheim, after 1974, he did criticize the National Guard, Cyprus government, for its troops actually going close to UN posts so they would attract the fire of the invading forces towards the UN positions. Now, these reports may be inconsequential, but sometimes they may have some consequences at times. The Annan Plan, for instance, and the rejection by the Greek Cypriots defend and possibly more to lose than their fellow Turkish Cypriots. On the views of the two communities and the relations, I think, with their mother countries, I think it's quite clear that the Turkish Cypriots are far closer to Ankara than Greek Cypriots are to Athens. 1963 proposals by Makarios did not have support of Athens. They tried to assassinate him during the junta, and of course, the Annan 2004, the Greek government did not, even though it did not go against, but did not support the views of the late President of Cyprus. Throughout the past half a century, this is the concluding paragraph, or so the UN has been trying to break the logjam and introduce a settlement to Cyprus problem. Through peacekeeping operation, it has been reasonably successful in the maintenance of ceasefire and containing the conflict, but the solution has proved elusive. There must be willingness of the local parties and the international players, and this is very difficult. When one is present, the other is absent. However, as politics is full of surprises, the fast-changing environment in international relations may produce an instance of such convenience when both internal and external conditions for a settlement would appear ripe. Many independent variables, however, as noted above, would have to come into play before such an outcome could be envisaged. Turkey's European aspirations, as well as the trends in its domestic politics, together with other regional developments, will undoubtedly have bearings on Cyprus. So will, of course, the political aspirations of Cypriots themselves as to their desires for the outcomes of the de facto partition of their country. The United Nations can and will continue to facilitate a settlement, but only in the context of such factors. It is not equipped to provide a new context of its own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for what I think was a highly pragmatic assessment of the role of the UN in relation to Cyprus. I will now move swiftly on to Venedi, who will speak on a subject dear to my heart, political engagement for our community in the UK.
Thank you, Peter, and I'm trying to address what I'm presenting in a pragmatic and practical way, which is one of the approaches that I have throughout my involvement with the British trade union movement achieved, which is you look at what the problem is and then you identify its causes, but once you do that, you move towards proposing practical solutions that can be measured and can be delivered. And I think I'm saying that in my introduction because I think that is where the problem has been with us. I'm a second generation Cypriot, Greek Cypriot, born in the 60s after the inception of the Republic. My parents came here I think in the late 50s. I am the son of immigrants. A lot of us here probably are if we're second generation. But we are the children of proud immigrants who came here and built this country up. We are the children of people who face severe discrimination, sometimes on unimaginable proportions, and all you have to do is go to the Windrush, which is predominantly about the West Indian immigration movement in the 50s. But there are some mentions of Cypriots, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and the struggles they face. Anyway, that's too long as an introduction. Apologies for this. I'll move into being practical now, otherwise I'm contradicting what I said at the beginning. My paper is about how we represent the Cypriot community in London, specifically in London. Of course, there are Cypriots in Leicester, only because my cousin's there, that's why I'm thinking of this, and Manchester and other places, but I'm just concentrating in London, otherwise we're going to be impractical and opening up too much. There are 300,000 Cypriots of Greek Cypriot origin, and I think 100,000 Cypriots of Turkish Cypriot origin. I'm not sure what the stats on the Turkish Cypriots are. In London, my shocking assessment is that we have a bigger population than the district of Nicosia. Yet, the Cyprus government, sorry if there is any representative of the Cyprus government here, has completely, well, not completely, but they have ignored us. Where is it? Oh, I love you, really. Okay. And that's one of the issues, if we're going to be practical about moving on and changing things, of how we're going to change that. And there's two reasons why we must change this. And I go back to the comments I made when my friend Mr. Choupras was doing his presentation, when he said, but the press is doing this and the media is doing that and it's not nice. Well, it's not nice because we haven't organized ourselves. We haven't done what the West Indian community does, which is being very vocal and very organized. And I'm from a trade union background, as you know. And I can tell you, not many things get passed through if transgressions are made or the media says X, Y, Z that isn't correct or right. The same with the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Board of Deputies. You try getting the Daily Mail to say something very negative about that. They will soon be on their back. That isn't really necessarily the biggest thing in my mind. My theme is about what have we done to ensure that our community, my mother and father, they're in their late 70s, are correctly represented What are we doing as successful? We've got a lot of successful second generation people here. I know people like my friend Peter, who is very successful. We have professors and doctors and lecturers here, and a lot of other eminent people who are second generation people. They are the product of parents who came over here, worked very hard. They made sure that education for their children was their priority, and we are the product of that. So what do we do as second generation to make sure that my nephew, who is 12, and I have a son, but he's half Spanish and he's in Spain, so I'll keep him out of this. He was very happy that Spain won last night, so that was good. I would be in trouble if Portugal won, because I've got a lot of connections with the Portuguese community too. So anyway, what are we going to do? What am I going to do? What are we all going to do to make sure that we deal with these problems? It's not just about the Cyprus problem. This is what I'm astounded all the time. It's all, the Cyprus problem is without any doubt a sacred issue. We must fight to ensure that a fair and just solution that ensures and guarantees that the two peoples in Cyprus. And I went to the London School of Economics in the University of London years ago, we won't go into the year. And I was there with Turkish Cypriot students, and I never saw anything different between myself and them. I can't see why we can't live together, we cannot progress, we cannot move on. But my generation have an obligation to the first generation, people who are discriminated. And I have seen this in action because in my position in the trade union, people sometimes misunderstand that trade unions deal with employment rights. So they come and say, look, this is what I'm getting. I went to hospital. They're treating me bad. I can't speak very good English. You know, they deal with me as though I'm some second-class citizen. What are we going to do to help those people? They helped us to be where we are today. And what are we going to do? And I divided it into three categories. For the third category, which is really worrying me, because my nephew, who is 12, is very interested in Arsenal winning all the time. And he's an Arsenal. I'm a Chelsea supporter, so we do disagree on that. But apart from that, I fear, and I had these discussions, I think, with you about 10 years ago, Mr. Tsipras, and with a minister from Cyprus who invited me to go to Cyprus in 2001, I think, during the Kyriakides administration. And again, I'm being critical, but I don't mean any offense to anybody here from the Cyprus government. Did the talk, but didn't deliver. There is a severe problem. What are we going to do when my 12-year-old nephew gets married to, I don't know, an English, Spanish, like I did, wife or whatever, and feels, as I think he does feel now, that he's more or less assimilated into the British culture, into the British society. He's been sent to Greek school, he's tried to learn Greek. Obviously it's never going to be good. When he's in Cyprus, he's sometimes, not himself, because I'm around. But people of that generation are called Charliers, issues that we have to deal with the Cyprus government and all that. What are we going to do about that? Because, you know, time goes quick. Very soon we're going to be in a position, in a place, where the third generation are going to be taking over from me and Peter. And people in our 40s, I'm assuming you're in your 40s. Sorry. Okay. So that's going to be changing. But nothing is being done, as far as I can see or understand, to first of all make sure that our community is represented. And when I'm talking about our community, I'm not talking about just Greek Cypriots. This is a matter about representing a community. I don't see any genetic difference between myself and the Turkish Cypriot. It's all nonsense. We were just one, and we've been indoctrinated. Yes, I do sound like a trade union person, but I am. Over the centuries, we have to move into action And although the brother from the Turkish Cypriot organization said, please, no more organization, I am saying, please, we need another one to make sure, which I'm starting only one, to deal with these issues. Because also here in Britain, I am involved with a number of British MPs who are simply saying to me, well, look, you're integrated, you're assimilated, you could easily, like George Alambridis, who is the leader of Merton Council now, we have we've got 22 councillors. Is it Steve Alambridis? Okay, I changed the name. We got 22 councillors who identify themselves as being of Greek Cypriot origin, and I think 10 of Turkish Cypriot origin, mainly in Enfield, Barnet, in one of our DJs on Al-Jar, actually, from Harry A, the councillor from Barnet. So there is movement, but this movement and these people, like John Kazantis in London Council, who's deputy, I think he's going to be deputy leader now, are not here, they're not involved, they're not feeling I have to do something to ensure that, first, that the delivering of services, government services, we pay for those services because we're taxpayers, is done in a fair and equitable way. I don't want to hear that my mother or my mother's neighbours who are in their 70s and don't speak very good English, who spend all their time working very hard for 30, 40 years and not getting what is rightfully theirs. But if there isn't some kind of a representative body to deal with that, and I said joke before, I sent a few letters to the Mail and the Standard, and they published them, and I was angry about something they said about the community. We have to challenge them. The answer is simple. You let them create or continue or amplify the images they're serving about the community, and they will continue. I got a letter of apology after a letter, this is 3 years ago. No big deal, but we need to stand up and deal with this thing. The other thing is, the Cyprus government is, of course, dealing with the primary problem, which is resolving the Cyprus problem, which I'm afraid is not going too well for many different reasons. I think a lot of mistrust is really what's behind it, plus those behind the scenes or countries that have been described as the powers behind the decision making. It's up to them to decide whether it's going to be resolved or not. Decisions are going to be made in Ankara, not so much in Athens. I mean, there's less involvement from Greece than there is from Turkey. So we are in a situation where a fundamental mistake committed by the Cyprus government is to ignore the 300,000 or so, that was, I think, based on the census in 2001, people who identified themselves as being of Greek Cypriot origin or speaking Greek or something like that. I mean, my brothers are married to foreign women, so, the children I can identify either way. So the same with me, I was married to a Spanish one. So the issue there is the Cyprus government is making a huge mistake, and they have been making it for many, many years, ignoring the need to ignore the fact that they need to help and support the community here, and there's different ways of doing it. One is putting some resources into it and taking those who are making representations to them more seriously. Otherwise, okay, we might be okay today, but in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, we would lose the third generation, and that is a danger. It's a time bomb, and if we lose that, then that will be gone. Well, I've been told to shut up, so there you go.
We are running out of time. I'm very keen that we have a debate, particularly following such presenters. Please try to be brief because we are short of time. So please be brief to the point. If you want to direct them specifically to any of the presenters, just say so. Cyprus.
Andreas Rialas, yes?
Yeah.
Very good description of the situation as it is today. Now, this economic progress, if we can call it a progress, no doubt about Turkey, which are the reasons behind it? Stability, of course, that's very, very important, especially for a country for years and years could live with coups and new governments. Tourism, in the last, let us say, 3, 4, it might be 5 years. But what else? Could you please give your opinion?
I mean, they have, in the early years of the IMF package, they had an amazing Thatcherite type of privatization program that closed the fiscal balance down significantly. The first 3-4 years, it was something that they sold pretty much everything they could. They really sold a lot of assets, which was, Turkey has always been quite a state-run entity, really. So they privatized a lot of stuff that has closed down the balance. They had, for 2 or 3 years in a row, still do have an excellent inward investment capability. I mean, Turkey has attracted a lot of investments from abroad into the country. Just don't go far. I mean, National Bank of Greece invested 3.8 billion to buy a bank that was number 10 or something in Turkey. So it's not, they still bought the biggest bank, 3.4 billion. And similarly, because they have managed to get a lot of outside financing to reduce this problem through the stable interest rates. The fact that inflation was coming down, it creates a virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle basically being that everybody piles into the country to benefit from inflation and interest rates coming down. Therefore, the value of your investment goes up as soon as they're successful. So a lot of money went to Turkey. And second, they have done a lot about trade, and they help their medium-sized enterprises export a lot. You go to Eastern Europe, the most successful construction companies are Turkish nowadays. Used to be Greeks, they were very big. They were not, compared to what the Turks have done in Eastern Europe, is nothing. So basically very orthodox economic measures. I mean, nothing that really stands out in my opinion as a thing. Just stability, a bit of authoritarianism helps in these situations, you know. Unions, labor reforms, hasn't been a strike in Turkey for years, you know.
Thank you, Andreas. Andrew Gizmo.
Speaking from the points that are of interest to me, first of all on the third generation, I think you can learn lessons by looking at migrants who settled before the Cypriots did. And it doesn't necessarily follow that the third generation, even though they become assimilated, are going to lose their identity as well. If you look at the Jewish community, for example, they're probably 2 generations ahead of the Cypriot settlement, yet they've not lost their identity. It's founded not just through ethnicity, it's through the faith, and it's their way of life. So you'll find people are very assimilated, yet still identify themselves as Jewish. Similarly, other migrant groups. As far as representing the Cypriots living in the UK is concerned, I think this is a very important point. One of the things that I did when I was in Parliament was work with the Chinese community who felt very similarly. In fact, there are twice as many Chinese living in Britain than there are Cypriots, though they are more spread about. And they have practically no political representation whatsoever. And what we tried to do is set up what we call the Chinese in Britain group, in Parliament. The all-party China group was dealing with foreign affairs, and most of the Cypriot groups in Parliament deal with foreign affairs. But nobody, as you say, is looking at the role of representing the needs of people who actually live here. And one of the things that really struck me, first of all, was the importance of setting out a clear wish list of the things that need to be done. Now, I think the Cypriots are probably ahead of the Chinese in terms of progress on some of these issues. But for the last election, for example, the Chinese community produced their own manifesto of the things that they wanted a government to sign up to and deliver. And I think that probably is a practical way of trying to take things forward. It's all well having a good old whinge, but unless you actually have a clearly focused agenda of the things you want to achieve, you're not going to get very far.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Of course.
I think you're right, but I think there's some difference with the Jewish British community in that the religious aspect of it is, be careful here, slightly stronger than you would find within the Greek or Cypriot community. In terms of where we go and how we achieve this, there's different ways of doing representation. One of them is we already have a leader of a council in Merton. I'm hoping that we will have capable candidates like we tried to in Southgate, Enfield, but it didn't happen this time. The future is bright. I think there are a number of key people that can make it. And once we are able to get there, I mean, just doing a list, a wish list, I don't think would in itself be the best way to deal with it. We have got, say, 22% vote ID, say, in Southgate, Enfield. That's a winnable seat. I think, like Diane Abbott said 12 years ago, you get into that parliament and that's how you change things. And that's the short. I mean, you were there with Jeremy Corbyn in Islington is quite vocal about Cyprus issue. Okay, but it is a big debate, and as I said in my paper, it deserves a conference on its own. So where is Alicia? Yes, a conference on its own on that.
I'll just say just one thing. I agree with what both of you have said. I would say, in the light of my experience, right, I think that there is a need for greater responsiveness from the British political parties as well to ethnic minorities generally. I don't think we've seen as much of that as I would want to see. Certainly, there has been a lot with some specific communities, like the black community and the Asian communities, but we haven't seen enough in relation to perhaps less obvious communities like the Cypriot community and so on, which I think is partly based on a lack of knowledge, within the parties themselves,
Just quickly, this goes back to what Nicholas was saying earlier on, that certain communities are much more forthright in saying what they want, which is why I said, if you don't have an agenda to work to, you're not going to get the response. You need to actually go and say, we want X, Y, and Z done. There are no shortcuts in politics. There's no, people always say, how can you get into Parliament? Is there a shortcut? There isn't. There's a lot of very hard work that goes behind it. So you need to work within the system as it now is, rather than as you dream it would be. And to do that, you have to have, if you're going to go to political parties, you have to have a clear indication of what you want done. And I think that the real problem with the Cypriot community has been the focus in Parliament, and in particular, has always been the Cyprus issue. Yeah. It's never been on the needs of the domestic Cypriots.
No, I agree. I agree with that. Andreas Constantinidis, Councillor Andreas Constantinidis, was a practicing politician in the Cypriots. So.
I think what Nicholas has said, that we need one organisation, and just one. And he mentioned the Board of Deputies. It's a very valid and very strong thing to go for. He also mentioned Southgate. What he didn't say, of course, is that there were probably more Cypriots canvassing against our own candidate than canvassing for him.
From the Labour Party?
Well, not from within the Labour Party. But there were Cypriots canvassing against Charalambous. And probably more canvassing against him than us that were canvassing for him. And this is where we lack towards other communities, although they may have their internal politics and differences. When it comes to trying to enter Parliament, you would probably find that they are more united, and you would never find, for instance, two of the same ethnic group fighting each other within the same constituency.
And when there is a candidate, irrespective of their politics, the Board of Deputies will support that candidate.
Thank you, Councillor Andreas. Kostas Klearchos.
I'm going to bring out, I think, what is the elephant in the room that we're not looking at. And that is that we do have an organization. We have a federation of Greek Cypriots here, of which we have the chairman here. All these organizations have always worked together and cooperated, but only on the national issue, on the question of the issue of that. And those of us who have made efforts in the past to get some of these organizations to start concentrating on the problems of the Cypriot community here have always failed to do that. And until the National Federation, and I think it's got to start from there now, the National Federation here tries to, actually takes it seriously, that we are here in this country, we're into the third generation now, we have put very deep roots into this country. All you have to do is go to New Southgate Cemetery and see the amount of space that the Greek Cypriots are occupying there. You realize that we're here to stay. And we really have got to take very seriously our life in this country, and not only as Cypriots, but also as British citizens. We've got to get involved with the political life of this country, and we've got to act as British citizens with a Cypriot identity, of course. But really, to me, in this discussion, this is the elephant in the room. The National Federation has got to take its responsibility seriously and start getting involved with the actual issues that matter to the people who live here.
Thank you, Kostas. And bearing in mind that I am the president of that federation, I think I should be allowed to respond very briefly. Just to say that...
I didn't mean as a personal...
No. I've been
a member of it from the beginning to recently.
I've been one of the most outspoken advocates, precisely that. I mean, before I was elected to the Federation and since, both within and outside the Federation. I mean, my contribution to this conference last year was precisely that. It was about how we politically become more engaged, as a community, in British politics, and how the Federation and other organisations working together would be able to deliver a strategy, to enable the community to achieve a lot more. I mean, what my background is. I've been involved with the Labour Party for quite a number of years. I've been a councillor in Harringay, so I've had a lot of exposure to the British political process, for many, many years. I think that there are a lot of issues, some of which Nick has identified, and some of which you have identified, Kostas. I think that a lot of energy has been expended and is being expended on the Cyprus issue. There is a lot of passion in our community still in relation to that issue, and that is a good thing. But that isn't to say that we shouldn't concentrate on other things. I think we can do both. I've been saying that for quite a while. Michael Kashis.
Yeah, what I was going to say was to achieve all these targets down the road, we have to join the British political parties. There's one thing we don't do very well. I represent one political party from Cyprus, which is good, but at the same time, we should, especially the young people, should join the political parties of this country where decisions are made that can influence things in the stage of making, rather than expecting after decisions are made to come correct through the federation.
I've been observing a couple of you speaking, Nicholas in particular, and there seems to be some ambiguity over the use of the word Cypriot here. In the programme, you say mainstreaming and organising representation for the Greek community. You speak about Cypriots. And other people have spoken about Cypriots, and they've used it interchangeably with Greek Cypriot. You have to be, as I said earlier in my presentation, culturally sensitive when using the word Cypriot. You have to really mean it. That's it.
Thank you.
I think I hope I didn't confuse the issue. To say that the idea that I have come up with about representing the community and not just being an exclusive movement for the Cyprus problem have a lot to do with discussions I actually have with Peter Droussiotis, who's been doing quite a lot. You have to remember that he came into it, and there are moves and efforts to change it, but change is evolutionary. It takes time to change them. Somebody said that we're not organised and we don't have representation. We do. We've got 22 councillors in London. We probably more. I just went... Okay, so it must be more than 22. And we got a leader in Method. We're not that bad. But more needs to be done. In terms of a friend from the Turkish Cypriot organisation, I was presenting this as representing those people whose language is Greek, so the title Greek Cypriots came into it. But as I said when I was presenting my paper orally, it doesn't have to be about. These are issues that they're not political issues. If someone has a problem going to hospital and getting services, it's not an issue about race or background or ethnicity. It's about helping them not to have those problems.
I agree, but you said Greek community, not Greek Cypriot. Just correct me.
Well, there is a Greek community right now. We can't ignore that.
I think the point has been made. Are there any other? I mean, there was just one point actually that in relation to what Andrew said on this issue of representation that I want to address as well, and it is this. I mean, the issue of representation, right, in politics in this country is partly to do with how the British political parties are organised as well. And it is to do with how they select, their candidates. I think Michael Kashis said we need to have more members in these parties. I think, in some respects, we've gone beyond that now. I mean, there are significant issues to do with how candidates are selected within these parties as they are, whether they're English or Welsh or whatever. I mean, what you have in many constituencies, you have less than 200 or even 100 people, involved in these selections. Is that a democratic way to select the people who actually sit in Parliament and represent the interests of their constituents? I argue that there are question marks as to whether that is the case. So there are a lot of issues to do with how selections are done, whether there should be primaries involved. I'm not an advocate for that necessarily, but I'm just saying that there are a lot of issues to do with that we as a community need to address as well. But because I think we've covered a lot on this issue, are there any other questions or points in relation to what James had to say or in relation to the UN that was covered by three? Professor Robert Fox.
You didn't draw a direct connection with talks. You were leading, could you sort of elaborate your theme slightly more to make a linkage with
The current talks and the debate.
Is it meant to lead in that direction, or?
Well, yes and no. I mean, as we all know, I mean, the talks now have been going on for over 2 years, and security, which was cited by people in 2004 as one of the predominant reasons why they chose to vote against the Annan Plan, has been subject to almost no debate whatsoever between the two sides. The whole discussion so far have focused on sort of key issues of governance, obviously property, territory issues, and security has just been left to one side completely. There are obviously a number of reasons for that, not least of all, it's the one area of the talks which just cannot be regarded as a bicommunal issue. It goes beyond the two communities. You can't talk about security and a Cyprus solution without necessarily involving Turkey, Greece, Britain, and outside actors. Somebody's got to play a role in securing all of this. So really, the question I was raising about NATO was more because it is going to be considered one of the actors that could potentially become involved in a settlement process, either guaranteeing it or guaranteeing the security of the island afterwards. And it has raised such deep divisions within the Greek Cypriot community, especially on the left-right axis, but not entirely, because EDEC has been much more positive about Cyprus engaging with NATO, that really it just seemed one of those sort of debates which isn't raised enough, but it does need to be thought about a little bit more seriously.
Thank you very much. I see a number of hands, so I'll take them. I think Mr. Suleiman, please.
Yeah, I'll ask a question in relation to what you have said about NATO anyway. I mean, the Cypriot people generally, up till now, have been looking at a lot of our problems have been, the source has been NATO. I mean, NATO has been at the bottom of a lot of the problems that the Cypriots are suffering. Now, I mean, how do you propose that you would convince Cypriots? I mean, if there was a move for NATO membership, how would you? I mean, would you advocate a referendum? And in such a referendum, do you expect Cypriots to vote for a NATO, to join NATO or Partnership for Peace? I think it's already. There was an attempt in Parliament apparently before. And as you rightly say, there was one just the left were against that. But would that be a serious mediator in terms of, would people accept NATO as a serious mediator, where they look at this you were, or that NATO was the source of the problem? Now, that's one. The second thing, I just want to make comment on what Nick said. Basically, what we should do, I mean, if you look back, trade unionists in Cyprus were the ones who moved for a bicommunal move. I mean, we've got heroes like Ahmed Sadi, for example, if you know about him. And basically, I mean, I don't know if you... Well, that's it.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, I mean, again, what I'd say is that, look, I should say that my particular stance on this is agnostic. I don't advocate one way or another. I mean, I can see very clear reasons why people in Cyprus would feel very nervous about the possibility of NATO membership or even Partnership for Peace. I can understand the historical legacy of this, why there's a lot of deep opposition, especially in Akel, towards membership. I wouldn't presume to claim to understand the position of the Turkish Cypriot community on this, which of course is an issue that would have to be thought about, especially in the context of the solution. But as I tried to mention in my brief talk, there are also very strong reasons why I think Cyprus should engage with NATO, that there are questions about post-conflict peacekeeping issues that might be best handled within NATO. As I say, it might be better to keep the UN. But there are also very, very important questions about Cyprus's relationship with the European Union. And I think that one way or another we have to recognise that, and I say this as a very, very committed Europhile, almost to a Euro-federalist, which is an extremely unpopular view and one which gains no traction these days. I think it's very sad, but the debate is now completely off the agenda in European security circles, that this is just not a debate that we're having about an independent European security policy which Cyprus could sign up to, which would be separate from NATO. We have to accept that now that France is back in NATO structures fully, that NATO is the lead actor for European security, and at the moment Cyprus is completely outside of that. And is that really an area that Cyprus wants to be? And this is one of the planks why, for example, VC has advocated quite strongly that Cyprus should be more engaged in NATO platforms. But as I say, I remain completely agnostic on this issue. It was really precisely to generate this sort of debate that I thought it'd be interesting to talk about it today.
Thank you, James. The gentleman here. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Baron Ateliadis. It's about what James has said about the negotiations and the present negotiations that are being carried out. Unfortunately, it was said that the two communities, they are meeting together, negotiating, but the security is not a bilateral side. It is something that somebody else needs to be involved. Unfortunately, the other side needs to be involved, and I mean Turkey, right through for everything. Because only recently the Foreign Minister of Turkey has said, and I quote, "If there wasn't a single Turkish Cypriot in Cyprus, we should have invented him." That is what he meant, and that was very significant and very honest for a politician. Sorry, Andreas. Very honest for a politician to say that, because it goes to show how Turkey is treating its own Turkish Cypriot community. And behind the negotiations, right through for every subject, the Turkish Cypriot, the current one, and the previous ones, they go back to Ankara, they take their directions, and they come back. How could the Greek Cypriot negotiator, in this case Christofias, negotiate under these circumstances? And there is so much common sense going around this table today. It's absolutely fantastic. And you will think that once we go out of here, if they listen to all of us, the Cyprus problem is solved. Unfortunately, in reality, this is not the case, because the country that is pulling all the strings or ropes is Turkey. And it's not in the interest of Turkey to solve the Cyprus problem in the way that people have been talking around here today.
I'll just give a very, try and keep a brief response to this. I mean, the problem with trying to address the security issue in Cyprus has always been one of asymmetry. That both communities feel themselves fundamentally at risk and at threat, requiring some sort of outside security. So in the context of the island, the Turkish Cypriots, with 20% of the population, have always felt very insecure regarding the Greek Cypriots, with 80% of the population. So how do you then create a security structure which protects them, but also recognises that in the regional context, Greek Cypriots are a tiny minority as compared to Turkey? And this has always been the fundamental problem that's made trying to deal with the security issues so very complex in Cyprus. How do you manage those relative security relationships between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and between Greek Cypriots and, more broadly speaking, Greeks with Turkish Cypriots and Turkey? And this is the fundamental conundrum that I think that anyone who's been trying to deal with security on Cyprus has been trying to overcome for a very long time. And what I would simply say on this is I believe that this is an area where I think the European Union can play a very, very important role in this. And I think that what we need to do is really actually start to unpackage the question of security, and what do we really mean by this? And at the moment we just sort of call it security, and we tie it military security with political security, and I think that you can separate those off. And if you start to separate them off and you look at what do people really need and who best provides it, so physical security is what we would think of as military, and how can we deal with that? But at the same time, the system that was created under the 1960 Constitution, where countries have a military right to defend the political situation, I think anyone could say is probably anachronistic in the 21st century. And it's splitting those two elements off and trying to see what is the best, most functional way of doing that, which I think really represents the problem that we're going to have to deal with if and when we get to the real debate over security in the current round of talks. But it is a tremendously thorny issue, and one that I know a lot of people are giving a lot of thought to try and see if we can come up with brand new inventive ideas to deal with this.
Thank you very much. I've seen Klearchos Kyriakides.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can I thank all of the speakers? I found their analyses refreshing and illuminating. It's a question for James, which I've raised in the past. It's envisaged that the Cyprus question will result in the establishment of a so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation. The concept I find inappropriate and unacceptable, but that's by the by. My question is this, though, which follows on from that. Can a bizonal, bicommunal federation formulate a national security strategy which is viable and in the interests of the Republic, one way or the other? Because my argument is that before any settlement, there needs to be an agreed joint national security strategy, and then you construct the security apparatus in the light of that strategy. Whereas what seems to be happening is that there's a movement towards a settlement, and then we'll think about what our national security strategy is afterwards. This wouldn't matter if Cyprus was situated in the mid-Pacific, but given the location of Cyprus in relation to Iran, the Palestinian and Israeli question, Egypt, and North Africa generally, it's a question that I think is of fundamental importance, and I welcome your thoughts in view of your expertise on security issues.
I have to agree. I mean, as I said, Cyprus sits in a very dangerous part of the world, but I think therein lies the answer. That, as I mentioned in the previous answer, the problem is that we've always had, when talking about Cyprus and security, is that debate has always been structured in terms of the two communities and in terms of the wider neighbourhood, Greece and Turkey. When, of course, now I think that we can actually argue that there's a whole range of other issues that we need to be considering very seriously in the context of Cyprus. I mean, we can talk about smuggling, we can talk about various types of trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking. These are fundamental issues that Cyprus has got to come to terms with. And I think that these are issues that the two communities can reach solid agreement on. That this doesn't require an us versus them zero-sum terms of thinking. In terms of hard military security vis-à-vis countries in the region, again, I think that this is an area where more thought needs to be given. The mantra has been demilitarisation of Cyprus. I happen to believe that I think there is a very good argument to be made that there needs to be a more open debate on this, and that with the possibility of exploring the options for things like a Coast Guard, some sort of air defence system. I know that others have suggested this, and I think there is a very good reason why Cyprus might need to take this on board. But whether that then needs to extend to ground forces, on that I don't think that there is. But nevertheless, as I say, I think that we can look beyond the traditional military security agenda in Cyprus and actually come up with far more creative and inventive issues and problems that need to be solved, which don't divide the communities.
I'm going to take three questions, last questions, and I've seen three people who want to ask those questions, so I'll take them in the order in which I've seen them. Andreas, sorry, I've seen two more now, but that is always thus, but I will take those as well. So I've got five questions. Please be brief.
Thank you, Peter. Does that mean that because of the security question and the importance of Cyprus in that area, which is really the most troublesome area of the world, does that mean that the feelings of the people of Cyprus, both Greek and Turkish, do not come into it at all, because important considerations overcome democracy and everything else, as we know?
Are these all questions directed at James?
Very quick. Take them all together.
We'll take them all together, I think. Okay.
Very quick. I wonder how James takes it as a priority question, or at least a question which someone would deal with it now. Everyone, of course, thinks about all the subjects which will be covered by the talks. Up to what point, what kind of progress has been made up to now? And we have so many other questions where there is actually an impasse. The question of the security will be sometime it will come up in the agenda, and when they come up, all those questions will be dealt with. But hopefully, I would say, let us hope that we'll get to that point. And when we get to that bridge, then we'll see how to deal with it.
Very quickly, on the question of NATO, our discussions would lead one to believe that it's up to Cyprus to decide whether it can join NATO or not. As a very young as a schoolboy, in fact, at the time of the Lancaster House negotiations, discussions, I heard the rumour that Archbishop Makarios actually offered to join NATO, and he was rejected out of hand by Turkey and by Britain. I had this actually confirmed to me by two people who were part of those negotiations. I did ask the Archbishop himself, and he just smiled his enigmatic smile and said, let history be history. It is not the Cypriots who didn't want to join NATO at the time under Makarios. It was no way did Britain want NATO anywhere on the island, because they did not want anybody coming into their bases. They were afraid and in fact it was part of what Makarios said at the time, that perhaps you could have a Greek contingent and a Turkish contingent in the British bases. And the British had apoplexy at the time. And I don't think the situation has changed from that point of view. It is not up to the Cypriots whether they want to join. They made the best of it by being enthusiastic, non-aligned. And of course, with Agel today in the government, I don't think that they're likely to propose anything of the sort. But throughout history, it really has not been the Cypriots who have rejected NATO. It is NATO, in the guise of Turkey and UK, who have rejected the Cypriots.
Thank you, Kostas. I see Nikki.
I just want to add one word to what Kostas has said. I think it's a false dilemma right now to discuss NATO, because I don't think it's Cyprus that generates a problem about NATO. It's the Turkish veto that really forbids us from even thinking about it. And not only that, I think that the NATO countries have a stronghold in Cyprus, and they don't need really to have any more. What I am afraid of is that we leave out the whole thing and the whole Cold War, which may be going on subterraneously with Russia. And Cyprus is in a strategic place like that. And I think demilitarization is something that shouldn't be discussed lightheartedly, that we should take into consideration without being demilitarized and part of NATO. Just demilitarized will do. Anyway, women's movement will be for peace and against armies in Cyprus.
Thank you. I will take the last question from Maria.
It's not directed to Nicholas and yourself. Just a brief point. I was wondering if we could do more as a community to help inform our own community here of how to deal with things in Cyprus, for example, if they're buying a flat or if they're dealing with an inheritance. Because there are structures, for example, Citizens Charter on the DLO websites and things, but people don't always know this. And especially at the Lobby for Cyprus meeting, I felt a lot of defeatism. Oh, you can't do anything in Cyprus, there is the Meta. There are structures there, and I just feel as a community, could we be doing more to inform people of how to use the structures in place and possibly work to improve them yet further, so that you don't have this sort of defeatist approach from immigrants, second and third generations, that, well, whatever happens in Cyprus, it's all mafia, you can do nothing. I think as a community, could we possibly be pushing more to help people, to help themselves and deal with Cyprus structures?
Thank you, Maria. James,
I know time is pressing on. I think on the first comment about feelings of people, this has obviously got to be paramount. One of the problems that we saw in 2004 with the ways the process, I mean, I have my particular views on the Annan plan, but I can readily accept that the process was deeply flawed, and I think that this is something that's been taken on very clearly by the UN this time round. They've understood that. They've tried to make this essentially a Cypriot-led process. And I think it is tremendously important when we get onto questions of security, but we've also got to remember that when we talk about security, I mean, again, we're trying to weigh up the problems that the two communities have fundamentally different approaches to this. And we've seen in recent months that there's been this zero-sum approach to it. You've had the Greek Cypriots saying, look, we cannot possibly have any sort of guarantees. You've then had a Turkish Cypriot response saying, we must have a guarantee. And I think that the question we really need to be considering is how do we unpick this to try and provide a way that both sides, both communities can feel that their fundamental security is taken care of without feeling a threat. So Turkish Cypriots don't need to feel threatened by Greek Cypriots. Greek Cypriots don't need to live under the threat of a major, large Turkish army sitting just 40 miles to the north. On the question of NATO and Cyprus to decide, I mean, it's quite clearly, you know, there's all sorts of debate about who's rejected it, and, you know, the historical record, Kyriakides has said quite clearly for the Greek Cypriot side that this was a reason why Makarios didn't want Cyprus to join NATO. I remember I interviewed Osman Orek, who was, many people would know, was actually the first Minister of Defence of Cyprus after independence, and he recounted a story to me of Kuchuk going and trying to persuade Ankara that, look, we should join NATO, and Ankara saying in absolute certain terms, no, leave this aside, let the Greek Cypriots have their wish on this. We don't want Cyprus to join NATO because it will make it that much more difficult for us to intervene. In 1963-64, there was, of course, a very strong British push for the establishment of a NATO peacekeeping force in Cyprus. This was actually the preferred option of the British government and Washington, and it was actually very, very heavily opposed by President Makarios. It was. The British plan was to try and have a NATO-based peacekeeping force established in Cyprus. Yes, peacekeeping force. No, it wasn't established. I'll go into all sorts of details as to how I can be absolutely sure that this was Britain's intention in 1963-60. I spent 3 years writing a PhD thesis on this exact subject, but it was actually very strongly rejected by President Makarios, who actually managed to enlist Russian help to ensure that the plan was defeated, and that then forced Britain to take it to the Security Council, and that's why we now have a UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus. So I would say that, you know, it's a very, very complex relationship that Cyprus has had with NATO, and as I say, very, very much agnostic on this. Final point is on Russian element and on security. Of course, we have to take this into account, and I think that this is very important. Any solution to Cyprus is going to have to get past the Security Council, and we need to make sure that Russia is fully on board, fully signed up to whatever agreement that is. Hopefully, at the same time, Moscow will recognise its responsibility, as well as everyone else recognising. So, you know, everyone's, I think, going to have to make some movement and come up with some sort of solution, which essentially is going to guarantee whatever settlement is put in place.
Thank you, James.
Everyone.
I'm going to bring this session to a conclusion. I'd like to thank our presenters, James, Andreas, Nicholas and Farid, for their excellent contributions, and I'd like to thank all of you for your contribution as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've been photocopying, just so you know, there are additional documents of the papers that we have received. So we have a number of documents tabled.